The most profound and unsettling challenge to the accepted narrative of human civilization does not originate from speculative theories or fringe archaeology, but from a series of meticulously catalogued, physical artifacts resting in the vaults of the world's most prestigious museums, the Sumerian king lists. These ancient administrative records, inscribed in the world's first known writing system, cuneiform, upon durable clay tablets, present a chronological account that stands in direct and violent contradiction to every established paradigm of modern anthropology, archaeology, and evolutionary biology. Dated to approximately 2100 BCE during the Third Dynasty of Ur, these tablets claim not merely to document contemporary reigns but to preserve a far more ancient lineage, stretching back into a primordial epoch that precedes a cataclysmic global deluge. According to these lists, 8 monarchs ruled the city-states of Sumer in this antediluvian age, and their reigns are recorded not with symbolic or rounded numbers, but with precise, staggering specificity. The first king, Alulim of the city of Eridu, is credited with a reign of 28,800 years. His successor, Alalngar, ruled for 36,000 years. The third king, Enmenlu Anna of Bad Tibra, governed for 43,200 years. The list continues: Emengal Anna, 28,800 years. The shepherd god Demused, 36,000 years. Ensipatzadana, 28,800 years. And Mendarana of Sapar, 21,000 years. And finally, Ubra Tutu of Shurapak, 18,600 years. The cumulative rule of these 8 antediluvian sovereigns totals an astonishing 241,200 years. This figure is not presented as mythology or allegory. It is recorded with the dry, bureaucratic tone of a state chronicle, the same tone used to list tax receipts or grain stores. This time span is not merely an exaggeration. It represents a duration that fundamentally exceeds the entire timeline for the existence of anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, as understood by contemporary science, which estimates our species' emergence around 300,000 years ago. The implications are seismic. The lists were not singular anomalies. Multiple copies have been excavated from sacred scribal centers like Nippur and from the city of Larsa, demonstrating that this chronology was considered canonical and authoritative history across Sumer for centuries. The initial scholarly reaction in the early 20th century was one of immediate dismissal, with academics proposing the figures must be mythological inflation, the aggrandizement of ancestral heroes, or a scribal error where lunar cycles were mistakenly recorded as solar years. Yet, every attempted rationalization fails under scrutiny. Converting the years into lunar months still produces individual reigns spanning thousands of our years. The numbers themselves exhibit a deliberate mathematical coherence, being elegant multiples of 3,600, the Sar, which was the highest unit in the Sumerian sexagesimal base 60 numerical system. This pattern suggests calculated recording, not haphazard invention or poetic hyperbole. The king list prefaces this impossible epic with a phrase of foundational and ontological significance. After the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This concept of descent is the cornerstone of the entire Sumerian worldview. The verb used, sud, denotes a literal lowering or bringing down, the same term applied to rain falling from the sky or a bird alighting on the ground. It describes a fundamental transfer of the very principle of ordered authority from the divine realm of a term meaning both the physical sky and the abode of the gods, to the terrestrial plane of Ki, the earth. This is not a later theological justification fabricated by kings to legitimize their power. It is the axiomatic premise upon which all Sumerian concepts of governance, knowledge, and social structure were built. Their foundational texts assert they did not invent city building, writing, law, mathematics, or astronomy through a slow process of cultural evolution. They inherited these things. Civilization, in this view, was not an emergent property of human social complexity but a delivered package, a preconfigured template lowered from heaven. The king list, therefore, is far more than a historical curiosity with inflated numbers. It is a direct and formal counter-narrative to the core modern doctrine of human progress, a doctrine that champions gradual, self-driven advancement from primitive hunter-gatherer bands to complex agricultural societies and eventually to urban states. The tablets posit a radically different origin story, a pre-flood age administered by beings whose very nature and perception of time were fundamentally alien to our own, followed by a cataclysmic global reset, after which a modified, perhaps delegated form of kingship and knowledge was once again descended to guide a fledgling and amnesiac humanity. The disquieting power of the king list lies in its utterly matter-of-fact tone. It is not written in the flourishes of epic poetry. It is stark, administrative, and bureaucratic. This sober sincerity forces a profound and uncomfortable epistemological question upon the modern observer. Are we dealing with pure cultural fiction, or with a historical tradition so ancient and meticulously preserved that it contains the distorted, numerical memory of a reality for which we possess no scientific framework? The clay tablets themselves are indifferent to our academic paradigms. They preserve only what was pressed into them 5 millennia ago. To dismiss them outright as fantasy is to willfully ignore the first complex, written historical document our species ever produced. To accept their literal meaning, however, is to demand a complete dismantling and reassembly of the established framework of human origins. This is the exquisite and unresolved dilemma posed by these silent slabs of inscribed clay. The cataclysmic flood that serves as the definitive chronological and thematic pivot in the Sumerian king list, acting as the great divider between the antediluvian world of impossibly long-lived rulers and the post-diluvian world of more familiar, if still lengthy, monarchies, has undergone a dramatic transformation in modern scholarship, from the realm of pure myth into the domain of verifiable geology and archaeology. This evidentiary shift, which lends startling credibility to the broader Sumerian historical claim, began in earnest during the pioneering Mesopotamian excavations of the 1920s and 1930s. At the ancient city of Ur, the renowned archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley and his team made a stratigraphic discovery that sent shockwaves through both the academic community and the public imagination. Digging down through the immense occupational mound or tell, they encountered a stark, unmistakable geological boundary. A continuous stratum of perfectly clean, water-laid silt, approximately 8 feet, 2.5 meters, thick at its center. This layer was sterile, containing no cultural material whatsoever. No pottery shards, no stone or metal tools, no charcoal from ancient hearths, no animal bones. It sat as a profound silence in the soil, a clear dividing line in time. Beneath this sterile layer lay the remains of a simpler, pre-Sumerian settlement, later identified with the Ubaid culture. Above it began the sophisticated debris of the historically known Sumerian city of Ur. Woolley, immediately connecting this physical evidence to the cuneiform legends he knew so well, famously telegrammed the London Times with the dramatic announcement, "We have found the flood." He was careful to clarify he had found evidence of a massive, region-wide inundation, not necessarily the singular biblical event, but the correlation with the written records was undeniable and profound. This discovery was not an isolated phenomenon. Subsequent excavations at other pivotal Sumerian urban centers revealed similar geological signatures. At the ancient city of Kish, a distinct layer of riverine clay and sand was found separating 2 major cultural phases. At Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, the very city from which the last antediluvian king, Ubar-tutu, was said to have ruled, archaeologists uncovered a deposit of waterborne sediment over 2 meters thick. These repeated findings transformed the Mesopotamian and biblical deluge narratives from theological allegory or moral fable into plausible reflections of a shared, traumatic environmental catastrophe that scarred the cultural memory of the region's inhabitants for millennia. The flood layer's patchy distribution, it is not found uniformly at every site, actually strengthens the historical case. Its irregular presence indicates it was not a mythical global ocean covering the highest mountains, but a colossal, localized disaster. Geologists posit it was likely caused by a catastrophic combination of factors: intense seismic activity in the region, unprecedented and prolonged rainfall, and the consequent breaching of the natural levees along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Such an event would have inundated the flat, alluvial plain where the early Sumerian cities were precariously perched, drowning some settlements entirely while sparing others on slightly higher ground, perfectly accounting for the irregular archaeological record. This geological reality dovetails powerfully with a remarkable and persistent global pattern. Over 200 distinct cultures worldwide, from the Greeks and their story of Deucalion to the Vedic tradition of Manu in India, from the Hawaiian legend of Nuyu to the flood myths of the indigenous peoples of the Americas and Australia, preserve a core narrative of a world-destroying deluge from which a scant few humans and animals survived to repopulate the Earth. This profound universality strongly suggests a deep, ancestral memory of one or more waterborne catastrophes so devastating they became permanently etched into the collective human psyche, encoded into oral traditions and later sacred texts. Modern geoscience offers several compelling candidates for such memory-forming events. The catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea Basin around 5600 BCE, as proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, posits that rising post-glacial sea levels caused saltwater from the Mediterranean to catastrophically burst through the Bosporus Strait, inundating a vast freshwater lake and its shoreline settlements in a geological instant, possibly within a matter of months, displacing thousands. An even more dramatic candidate lies in the rapid meltwater pulses at the terminal phase of the last ice age, particularly around 9600 BCE, when collapsing ice sheets caused sea levels to rise globally by dozens of meters, submerging enormous continental shelves that were once dry, habitable land. Of particular relevance to Sumer is the Persian Gulf Basin. Research by geologist Juris Zurins, supported by satellite imagery, indicates that during the last glacial maximum, what is now a shallow sea was a fertile, habitable river valley, dubbed the Gulf Oasis, fed by the extended channels of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and Wadi al-Batin rivers. As sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, this entire populated zone, potentially hosting early Neolithic settlements, was slowly and then catastrophically swallowed by the advancing waters, forcing its populations to migrate to the higher grounds of Mesopotamia and beyond, carrying with them indelible stories of a drowned paradise. The Sumerian flood account's uniqueness, however, lies not in its description of the disaster's mechanics, but in its stark description of the aftermath. The King List does not record that the survivors, through sheer resilience and ingenuity, slowly rebuilt civilization from the mud. It states with bureaucratic calm, "The flood swept over." After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The critical, repeated phrase is "kingship had descended." This posits the flood not merely as a natural disaster to be overcome by human effort, but as a cosmic reset of such magnitude that it required external, divine intervention to reestablish the very framework of ordered society. The post-flood kings listed, while still possessing reigns extraordinarily long by modern standards, often hundreds of years, are orders of magnitude shorter than their pre-flood predecessors, suggesting a fundamental shift in the nature of rule, lifespan, and perhaps the very conditions of biological existence. The archaeological flood layer, therefore, transforms from mere evidence of ancient climate into a potential geological signature for this hypothesized reset, a tangible line in the soil separating what the Sumerians understood as two distinct cosmic ages: the age of direct administration by the Anunnaki, and the subsequent age of delegated human self-governance. The tablets insist that the sophisticated urban culture which emerged in Mesopotamia after the silt settled was not a spontaneous product of gradual Neolithic evolution from the mud of the floodplain, but the result of core knowledge and the very principle of authority being deliberately and for a second time reintroduced from a source beyond the surviving humanity itself. If the Great Flood serves as the cataclysmic divider between two ages, the true and profound mystery lies in the nature of the pre-flood world and its inhabitants, whom the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, a term explicitly translated as those who from heaven to earth came. Within the intricate framework of Sumerian cosmology, these entities were not distant, abstract deities to be worshipped from afar through ritual and prayer. They were described, in text after text, as active, physical intelligences who involve themselves directly and practically in earthly affairs. They are depicted as a council of rulers, administrators, judges, engineers, and overseers who convened in assembly to make binding decisions about human destiny, allocated specific regions and cities among themselves as domains of influence, and directly instructed mankind in the arts and sciences necessary for civilization. The most explicit, technically detailed, and unsettling account of humanity's origins within this framework is found not in the King List, but in the Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian text dated to around 1700 BCE that preserves much older Sumerian oral and written traditions. The story begins not with a benevolent, spiritual creation, but with a stark labor crisis. The lesser gods, known as the Igigi, were tasked by the ruling Anunnaki with the backbreaking, millennia-long toil of digging the beds of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to make the Mesopotamian plain fertile and habitable. After 3,600 years of this relentless servitude, the Ijiji rebel. They burn their tools, surround the dwelling of the chief god Enlil, and demand relief. In the tense divine council that follows, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and cunning, Enki, also known as Ea, proposes a radical solution. Create a new, lesser being to bear this burden so that the gods may be free. The text then describes a procedure with chilling, clinical specificity, devoid of any spiritual grandeur. A god named Weila, or Ailu, who possesses the requisite personality or essence, is selected and slaughtered. His flesh and blood are then brought to the mother goddess Nintu, also called Ninhursag. The text provides what can only be read as a recipe. Mix the clay from the flesh and blood, let the god and the human be mixed together in the clay. Let there be a spirit from the god's flesh. This primeval biomatter is then mixed with clay from the earthly realm. The mother goddess then declares, I have removed your heavy work. I have imposed your toil on man. The mixture is placed into a ritually prepared womb or vessel, and after a period of gestation, the first humans, the Lulu Amalu, the primitive/mixed worker, emerge. The language is starkly procedural, reading more like a technical manual for genetic engineering or hybrid cloning, using the vocabulary of a Bronze Age culture, than a sacred myth of divine love and purpose. Humanity, in this oldest written creation narrative, is presented not as the pinnacle of spiritual evolution, but as a genetically engineered hybrid, a biological blend of terrestrial material, clay, and divine essence, flesh and blood, created for a purely utilitarian and exploitative purpose, servitude. This stands in radical, shocking opposition to all subsequent religious and humanist narratives that place humanity at the spiritual apex of creation, made in a divine image for a sacred purpose. Furthermore, the Sumerians believed that the components that constitute civilization were not developed through millennia of human trial, error, and innovation. They were discrete, tangible, and transferable principles or objects, known as the me, pronounced me. These me were the divine decrees, the immutable blueprints, for every single aspect of a functional, advanced culture. The list of over 100 me, detailed in texts like Inanna and Enki, included abstract concepts like kingship, victory, counsel, and truth, but also encompassed all the practical, concrete arts. The crafts of the scribe, the carpenter, the metalworker, both coppersmith and goldsmith, the leatherworker, the builder, the musician, the farmer, the weaver, the basket maker, and even socially complex roles like the prostitute and the priest. In the myth, the ambitious goddess Inanna travels from her city of Uruk to the older cult center of Eridu, the abode of the wise god Enki. After a feast where she plies him with beer, she persuades the inebriated Enki to bestow upon her the me of civilization. In his intoxicated state, he grants her sovereignty over more than 100 fundamental decrees. Inanna promptly loads these me onto her divine boat of heaven and flees to Uruk. A hungover Enki, realizing his catastrophic lapse, sends a series of demons and monsters to retrieve the stolen divine ordinances, but Inanna outwits them all and secures the me for her city. This story frames the rise of the great city of Uruk not as an organic political or economic development, but as the successful transfer, verging on intellectual property theft, of a prepackaged cultural and technological operating system from the older administrative center. Civilization, therefore, was a complete technology suite to be handed down, installed, and operated, not a discovery to be made piecemeal over centuries. This core concept of knowledge transfer from superior, non-human beings to humanity is a recurring global archetype, but the Sumerian version is the earliest, most detailed, and most bureaucratically recorded. In Egypt, the ibis-headed god Thoth descends to impart writing, mathematics, astronomy, and law. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl arrives from across the eastern sea to teach agriculture, maize cultivation, calendars, metallurgy, and arts. In Greek tradition, the titan Prometheus steals the fundamental technology of fire from the gods of Olympus for a helpless humanity. The Sumerian account is the foundational template. Their entire worldview suggests a period of direct, hands-on administration and genetic intervention by a more advanced order of beings, followed by a planned or catastrophic withdrawal to a more supervisory, distant role. The impossibly long reigns in the king list could then be interpreted not as the lifespans of human monarchs, but as the administrative tenures of these Anunnaki governors during their era of direct rule, with time perhaps measured on a different cosmological scale or perceived through a radically different biological consciousness. The flood, in this reading, marks the catastrophic or planned end of that era of direct management and the beginning of a new, riskier experiment. Human self-governance using the installed template of the me, under a revised and delegated mandate from the heavens. The Anunnaki did not vanish. They simply receded, watching, intervening occasionally, but leaving humanity to manage, for better or worse, a world they did not design, using tools they did not invent according to rules they did not draft. The sophistication of Sumerian knowledge, which appears in the archaeological record not in a gradual, evolutionary curve but in a state of startling completeness, further deepens the enigma and challenges the standard model of cultural development. The cuneiform script itself, emerging around 3200 to 3400 BCE in the city of Uruk, does not show a clear lineage from simple pictographs. While there were predecessor token systems for accounting, the leap to a full writing system capable of representing abstract thought, legal language, and complex narrative is abrupt. The earliest tablets, the so-called archaic or Uruk for texts, already employ over 1,500 distinct signs and demonstrate a grasp of syntax and grammar. There is no protracted proto-writing phase visible. The system appears operational from its inception, as if it was adopted in a mature form rather than invented through trial and error. Similarly, Sumerian mathematics was based on a sophisticated sexagesimal, base 60, and base 10 system, capable of performing advanced calculations, geometric operations, and accounting. Its legacy is indelibly stamped on our modern world. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This system appears fully formed in the earliest administrative tablets, used for calculating land areas, ration distributions, and labor forces with precision. Most perplexing of all are their astronomical records. Tablets like the Mul-Apen series, compiled around 1000 BCE but containing far older observational data, and the Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa from the 7th century BCE, recording 21 years of observations from centuries earlier, contain data of baffling accuracy. They knew the 584-day synodic period of Venus, the time between its identical positions relative to the Sun, with an error margin of less than 0.02%. They tracked the complex movements of other planets, predicted lunar eclipses, and maintained star catalogs that organized the heavens into a coherent, mathematical framework. This level of precision implies not just careful observation, but the existence of a long, unbroken tradition of observation spanning many centuries, if not millennia, to identify and verify such cycles. Yet, according to the conventional timeline, the Sumerians were only just emerging from the Neolithic at the time this knowledge was being recorded. The texts themselves often preface this data with phrases like, according to the old writings, or, as the ancient sages established, explicitly crediting even more archaic sources that, if taken at face value, would predate the flood. This presents a profound paradox. A civilization at the dawn of history, supposedly crafting its first cities, possessed a scientific and technical archive that implied a vast, pre-existing tradition. Where did this archive come from? The Sumerian answer, consistent across their literature, is that it was given to them. The god Enki, associated with wisdom, fresh water, and the subterranean ocean of knowledge called the Abzu, was the keeper and distributor of all fundamental knowledge, me. This is not merely a religious metaphor. It is a historical claim embedded in their foundational texts. When archaeologists dug into the deepest strata of the earliest Sumerian cities, they found evidence that complicated the story even further, hinting at a forgotten prehistory. At Eridu, the city of Enki and the site of the first kingship, excavators uncovered not one city, but 18 successive temples built one atop the other over millennia, with the earliest foundations dating to around 5400 BCE, nearly 2,000 years before Sumer's classical rise, around 3500 BCE. These early temples, attributed to the Ubaid culture, were already aligned on cardinal points and dedicated to the same god Enki, worshipped millennia later. Beneath the earliest of these temples, in some cases, excavators found layers of silt, and beneath that silt, traces of even older, cruder settlements. This pattern of cities beneath cities, and temples beneath temples, suggests an immensely long and largely unknown cultural gestation period. The Ubaid culture, circa 6500 to 3800 BCE, which preceded and directly influenced the Sumerians, established the first permanent settlements, irrigation agriculture, and the distinctive temple platform architecture that would evolve into the ziggurat. Intriguingly, Ubaid art is dominated by thousands of distinctive clay figurines found across southern Mesopotamia. These figurines depict humanoid forms with elongated, almost reptilian-like heads, large, almond-shaped eyes, and slender, genderless bodies. Mainstream archaeology cautiously labels them ritual objects or fertility figures, but their widespread, consistent form across a vast area and long period suggests they represented something specific and recognizable. Perhaps a stylized memory of the Anunnaki themselves, or a ruling priestly class that practiced extreme cranial deformation. The transition from the Ubaid culture to the Sumerian is not clearly understood. It appears less like a violent conquest and more like a cultural and linguistic transformation or takeover. The Sumerians may have been a later population who arrived, absorbed the existing Ubaid infrastructure, and inherited their fading, mythologized memories of the founders, encoding those memories into their king lists and creation epics as the time of the gods before the flood. The sophistication of early Sumerian society, therefore, might not be a sudden invention, but the resurgence and reorganization of a much older, partially lost technological and cultural package, preserved by a predecessor culture and finally committed to writing by their successors. The tablets, the mathematics, the astronomy, and the city plans all point not to a beginning, but to a renaissance, a remembering of something almost lost. The question of who or what these pre-flood beings were leads inevitably to an examination of the physical evidence. The skeletal remains and anomalous artifacts that have been unearthed across Mesopotamia and other ancient sites, evidence that is often documented but seldom integrated into mainstream historical narratives. Throughout the 20th century, during the excavation of key Sumerian and pre-Sumerian sites, archaeologists occasionally discovered human remains that defied standard anthropological classifications. At the Royal Cemetery of Sir Leonard Woolley, while focused on the spectacular gold and lapis lazuli treasures of the death pits, also noted in his field reports the presence of skeletal remains with atypical cranial formations. Some of these skulls, recovered from the deepest and oldest strata, exhibited extreme dolichocephaly, elongation that far exceeded normal human variation. Woolley acknowledged that some elongation could be attributed to the practice of artificial cranial deformation, a well-documented cultural practice where an infant's soft skull is bound to achieve a desired shape. However, he carefully distinguished certain specimens, noting features of internal structural elongation, unusual bone density, atypical suture fusion patterns, and increased cranial capacity that cranial binding alone cannot produce. Binding changes the shape of the skull, but does not significantly alter its internal volume or the fundamental architecture of the cranial plates. At the ancient city of Kish, excavators led by Stephen Langdon and Ernest Mackay in the 1920s uncovered similar anomalous remains in the lowest occupation levels, dated to roughly 3100 BCE. Field notes and sketches from the expedition, housed at the Ashmolean Museum, depict skulls with pronounced elongation and perplexing morphological details, accompanied by marginalia questioning whether they resulted from binding or natural formation, and recommending further analysis that, in many cases, never materialized. These physical anomalies are not confined to Mesopotamia. In Paracas, Peru, a desert peninsula yielded hundreds of mummified remains with skulls exhibiting dramatic elongation and, in some cases, cranial volumes up to 25% larger than the modern human average, with only one parietal plate instead of the usual two. Preliminary DNA analysis on a few of these Paracas skulls, though controversial and hotly debated, suggested the presence of mitochondrial and nuclear DNA sequences that did not match any known human haplogroup. In Egypt, the revolutionary pharaoh Akhenaten of the 18th dynasty is depicted in official statuary and reliefs with an elongated skull, a slender neck, wide hips, and a distended abdomen, a radical departure from traditional Egyptian artistic canon. His daughters are shown with similar features. While some medical historians have proposed conditions like Marfan syndrome, no single syndrome accounts for the entire suite of depicted traits, and the fact that his children share them suggests a hereditary characteristic, whether genetic or culturally emphasized. The ubiquitous Ubaid figurines of Mesopotamia, with their unmistakable elongated heads and large, oblique eyes, seem to echo these physical anomalies found in the soil, as if the art was depicting a remembered or observed physical type. Could these disparate pieces of evidence, scattered across continents and millennia, point to the existence of distinct humanoid populations in deep antiquity, populations that were later mythologized as gods, ancestors, or the Watchers? The Sumerian texts consistently describe the Anunnaki as physically present, interacting, eating, drinking, and arguing, implying they possessed corporeal form. The extreme reign lengths in the king list could be a garbled cultural memory of these beings' significantly extended lifespans, or perhaps an indication that they operated on a different perception of time, measuring their administrative tenures in units meaningless to human biology. The mainstream scientific consensus holds that Homo sapiens sapiens has been the sole surviving hominid for the last 30,000 years, but these scattered archaeological and osteological anomalies whisper a more complex, messy prehistory. They hint at the possibility of significant genetic variation within ancient human populations, isolated groups with unusual hereditary traits, or even hybridization events between Homo sapiens and other, now extinct hominid species like the Denisovans, whose genetic legacy is found in modern Melanesian populations but whose full physical morphology remains unknown. The Atrahasis epic's description of mixing divine flesh and blood with clay to create the Lulu reeds, through a modern lens, almost like a metaphoric account of genetic engineering or hybridization. If such an event, whether literal or symbolic of a more complex demographic and cultural process, formed the basis of Sumerian origin beliefs, it would explain why they saw themselves as fundamentally different from the gods, yet bearing a spark of their essence. The systematic lack of extensive, openly published modern analysis, such as comprehensive DNA testing, detailed osteological analysis, and isotopic studies, on many of these anomalous Mesopotamian remains is itself a subject of scrutiny. They are known within specialist circles, referenced in excavation reports, and stored in museum basements, but they are rarely brought to the forefront of public or academic discussion about Sumerian origins. They exist in a scholarly limbo because they are profoundly inconvenient. They challenge the clean, linear, and progressive timeline of human evolution and cultural development. To seriously entertain them is to open a door to questions that mainstream archaeology, with its current methodological and theoretical constraints, is not prepared to answer. The clay tablets speak of beings who were not us, and the bones, quietly stored in archival boxes, suggest that perhaps those beings were not purely mythological constructs but were rooted in a physical reality that has been buried twice, first by the silt of the flood, and second by the selective silence of modern interpretation. The discovery and subsequent translation of the vast Mesopotamian tablet collections, particularly the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, constitute a historical drama marked by intellectual shock, theological crisis, and a pattern of selective interpretation that borders on academic suppression. When George Smith, a humble engraver turned self-taught Assyriologist working in the British Museum's basement, pieced together a fragmentary tablet in 1872 and realized he was reading a detailed flood story predating Genesis by over a millennium, the effect was electric. Smith reportedly ran around the room in a state of undignified excitement before composing himself to announce the discovery. His subsequent public lecture, detailing the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, caused a sensation and a profound crisis of faith in Victorian England. Here was irrefutable proof that a cornerstone narrative of the Bible was not a unique divine revelation but part of a much older Mesopotamian literary tradition. The response from sections of the academic and religious establishment was not to embrace this new historical depth, but to carefully manage it. The strategy was one of framing. The Mesopotamian texts were labeled primitive mythology, the crude, polytheistic forerunners to the pure and elevated monotheistic accounts of the Hebrews. This allowed the biblical narrative to maintain its theological supremacy while acknowledging the older source, effectively containing the threat. However, as translators like Smith, Henry Rawlinson, and others delved deeper into the 30,000 tablet collection from Nineveh, they encountered texts far more disturbing than a pre-biblical flood story. They found the Atrahasis epic with its clinical account of human creation as engineered labor. They found texts describing the Anunnaki not as symbolic forces of nature, but as a council of physically present administrators. They found astronomical tablets with data of impossible accuracy. And they found references to a sophisticated antediluvian science, possessed by the Apkallu, the 7 sages sent by Enki to teach humanity all arts before the flood. Confronted with material that challenged not just religious doctrine but the very Enlightenment idea of humanity's independent, progressive ascent, many scholars engaged in a form of self-censorship through translation and emphasis. The procedural, biological language of Atrahasis was softened into more spiritual, allegorical terms in popular translations. Tablets with overtly non-human descriptions of the gods or references to pre-flood knowledge were translated for specialist journals but were not highlighted in public-facing scholarship. Some tablets were simply left untranslated in museum basements for decades, their contents known only from brief catalog entries. For example, a tablet series known as the Enuma Anu Enlil, a vast collection of astronomical omens and observations, contained data so precise that late 19th and early 20th century astronomers assumed it must be fraudulent or misdated, as it implied a continuity of observation stretching back thousands of years before accepted history. Rather than investigate the implication that this knowledge was preserved from a more ancient source, as the tablets themselves claimed, according to the old writings, the data was often dismissed as late or retrocalculated. The physical control of the artifacts also played a role. Access to the fragment collections was, and in some ways remains, restricted to a small number of accredited scholars. Tablets were dispersed between the British Museum, the Louvre, the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, and the University of Pennsylvania, making a holistic study difficult. The tragic looting of the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad in 2003, followed by the deliberate destruction of artifacts and tablet collections in Mosul and Nimrud by ISIS in 2015, resulted in the permanent loss of untold numbers of cuneiform texts, some of which had never been photographed, catalogued, or translated. This destruction erased potential keys to understanding this ancient worldview forever. The pattern, therefore, is a compound one: initial shock and containment through theological framing, followed by selective translation and emphasis that sidelined the most challenging material, compounded by physical control of access, and finalized by the irreversible loss of artifacts to war and iconoclasm. The result is that the full, radical thrust of Sumerian cosmology, with its engineered humanity, its descended civilization, and its memory of a lost, advanced age, has never fully entered the public or even the mainstream academic consciousness. It has been filtered, sanitized, and compartmentalized into the safe categories of mythology, literature, and early science, stripped of its most profound and disturbing historical claims. The question we must ask is whether this was a conscious conspiracy or simply the natural function of a paradigm, the modern scientific and historical paradigm, protecting itself from information that it cannot process without collapsing. When evidence emerges that contradicts a fundamental worldview, the first response is not to change the worldview, but to explain away, minimize, or ignore the evidence. The translated tablets that made it into textbooks were those that fit: stories of heroes, law codes, economic records. The tablets that spoke of the Apkallu sages, the me as physical objects, or the precise antediluvian astronomical data remained in the shadows, the forbidden knowledge of a forgotten age, suppressed not by decree but by the quiet, powerful inertia of an established narrative that has no place for them. The artistic iconography of ancient Mesopotamia, preserved on thousands of cylinder seals, stone reliefs, and cult statues, provides a visual language that powerfully corroborates and amplifies the written claims of the cuneiform texts. These are not abstract symbols, but deliberate, repeated depictions of scenes that encode a consistent and startling narrative of non-human intervention. The most prevalent and significant motif is that of the winged disk or solar orb, often accompanied by a towering, horned figure. This symbol, far from being a simple representation of the sun, is consistently shown in contexts of divine descent, judgment, and the transfer of authority. It is depicted not as a natural celestial body, but as a structured, technological-looking object, a central circle or capsule, often with a crossbar or wings, surrounded by radiating lines or smaller orbs, appearing in the sky above scenes of human adoration or divine interaction. On cylinder seals, this disc is frequently shown being approached by a large, anthropomorphic figure in a horned crown, the definitive Mesopotamian symbol for divinity, who emerges from it or is connected to it by a ladder or stream of rays. This visual grammar strongly suggests a vehicle or vessel of celestial origin, a skyboat or chariot of the gods, from which these beings disembark to interact with the earthly realm. The horned crown itself, worn exclusively by gods and deified kings, is not mere decoration. It signifies a higher order of being, a physical marker of Anunnaki status. The figures depicted wearing these crowns are consistently portrayed as significantly larger in scale than the human figures around them, emphasizing their superior stature and authority. They are shown holding unique, enigmatic objects that defy simple classification as ceremonial regalia. The most famous of these is the so-called handbag of the gods or bucket, a rectangular or pouch-like object with a curved handle, often held in the hand of a god or Apkallu sage. While conventional archaeology interprets this as a ritual bucket for holy water, bandudu, its consistent appearance in scenes of knowledge transfer, such as when a god is presenting the symbols of kingship or the tools of measurement to a human ruler, suggests it may represent something far more potent. A container of the me, a physical vessel holding the coded principles of civilization, or perhaps a device of unknown function. In the famous Atta seal from the Akkadian period, the water god Enki, is depicted with streams of water flowing from his shoulders, flanked by his minister, the Apkallu sage, who carries the distinctive bucket. Above them flies the winged disc. The scene is a concise pictorial representation of the entire Sumerian thesis. Divine wisdom, Enki, flows to earth, facilitated by a non-human intermediary, the Apkallu with his knowledge container, under the auspices of celestial authority, the winged disc. This iconographic trio, disc, horned god, and knowledge object, forms a recurring trinity across centuries of art. Even more compelling are seals that seem to depict specific technological or biological processes. Some show figures, identified as gods or sages, tending to what appear to be stylized trees or plants with tube-like connections, reminiscent of schematic diagrams for cultivation or genetic manipulation. Others, like a seal from the Berlin Museum, show a large god seated before a tree of life, while a smaller figure holds a device that looks like a modern gauge or meter, with lines connecting to the tree. While these can be interpreted as symbolic scenes of fertility, their precise, technical detail suggests they may be stylized records of actual processes of bioengineering or environmental management attributed to the Anunnaki. This visual evidence dovetails perfectly with the written descriptions of the Apkallu sages. Before the flood, 7 Apkallu served as advisors to the antediluvian kings. Texts describe them as purification priests of Enki, but also as the bringers of the arts of civilization: brickmaking, writing, law, and city building. They are described as part human, part fish beings, Apkallu of the Abzu, and are depicted on reliefs as hybrid figures wearing fish-skin cloaks, or with the body of a fish and the head of a human. This Piscine imagery directly connects them to Enki's watery domain of the Abzu, the subterranean source of all knowledge. Their hybrid nature visually reinforces the concept of the mingling of realms, divine and earthly, just as humanity itself was a mix of God and clay. After the flood, the texts say, these semi-divine sages were replaced by human Apkallu, wise men who possessed the knowledge but not the divine essence. The iconography thus chronicles a shift from direct, physical administration by hybrid beings to the mediated transfer of their knowledge to purely human successors. The sheer volume and consistency of this iconography across different city-states and millennia rules out the possibility of artistic whim. It was a formal, canonical visual language designed to communicate complex theological and historical concepts to a largely illiterate populace. What it communicates is unambiguous. Superior beings arrived from the sky in discernible vehicles. They possessed advanced knowledge and objects. They directly interacted with and shaped human development, and their legacy was passed down through a line of hybrid and then human custodians. When viewed not as religious art, but as a form of historical documentation, a pictorial record of events as perceived by the ancients, the cylinder seals and temple reliefs of Mesopotamia become a stunning archive. They show us what the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians believed they remembered. Not an age of primitive struggle, but an age of contact, instruction, and intervention by visitors who were masters of technology, biology, and social order. This visual record stands as a silent, persistent witness, corroding the modern argument that these civilizations slowly invented their gods and their stories. The gods, according to the art, were already there, and they brought the blueprint with them. The architectural and astronomical precision embedded within the very foundations and alignments of the earliest Mesopotamian structures provides a third pillar of evidence, one that is geodetic and mathematical, supporting the thesis of an inherited, non-human blueprint for civilization. The Sumerians did not simply build temples. They positioned and oriented them according to a sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics that appears fully formed at the dawn of their history. The city of Eridu, the first city where kingship first descended, was dedicated to Enki, god of wisdom, and the Abzu. Its central temple, excavated as a series of superimposed structures going back to 5400 BCE, was found to be aligned with uncanny precision to the cardinal directions. Such an alignment requires sustained astronomical observation over generations to establish a true north-south axis, a feat supposedly beyond a nascent Neolithic society. Furthermore, the layout of Eridu's sacred precinct appears to mirror specific celestial patterns. At Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, considered the bond between heaven and earth, the temple complex of Enlil was not only cardinally aligned, but its dimensions and proportions encoded mathematical constants related to the sexagesimal system. But it is in the celestial alignments that the most compelling evidence lies. The Sumerians, and later the Babylonians, possessed an astoundingly accurate star catalog. The Appen tablets list constellations and individual stars, chart the paths of the moon and planets along the ecliptic, and document heliacal risings, the first appearance of a star before sunrise after a period of invisibility. Their knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes, the slow, 25,800-year wobble of Earth's axis, is debated, but their star charts seem to reflect an awareness of changing stellar positions over vast epochs. Most tellingly, their mythology is deeply and specifically astronomical. The goddess Inanna, Ishtar, was explicitly identified with the planet Venus, and her mythical descent into and return from the underworld perfectly mirrors the planet's astronomical cycle. Its disappearance, inferior conjunction, period of invisibility, and triumphant reappearance as the morning or evening star. Her temples in Uruk were aligned to capture the light of Venus at key points in this cycle. The god Ninurta was associated with Sirius, the brightest star, and Saturn was known as the Steady One or the Judge, reflecting its slow, deliberate movement across the sky. This is not generalized star worship. It is a precise, one-to-one mapping of myth onto observed celestial phenomena, suggesting the myths themselves may be narrative records of astronomical instruction. This astronomical coding extends to city planning on a grand scale. The positions of the major Sumerian cult centers, Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Kish, Lagash, when plotted on a map, do not follow obvious geographic or defensive logic alone. Some researchers, like the historian of science Giorgio de Santillana, have argued they formed geodetic patterns reflecting constellations. For instance, the layout of these cities may have mirrored the Sumerian constellation of the Wagon, or Ursa Major, or other asterisms sacred to the Anunnaki. The concept was to create a terrestrial zodiac, mirroring the heavens on Earth, a practice well documented in ancient Egypt and, later, in the layout of Gothic cathedrals. This practice implies that the blueprint for Sumerian society was not just social or political but cosmological. The land itself was to be organized as a reflection of the celestial order administered by the gods. The most profound and controversial astronomical correlation, however, involves the Giza pyramids in Egypt and the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. While separated by centuries and miles, both architectural traditions encode advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge. The Great Pyramid's alignment to true north is more accurate than that of the Greenwich Observatory, and its dimensions incorporate the value of pi and the golden ratio. The Sumerian ziggurat, a stepped pyramid, was explicitly called a bridge between heaven and earth during Ki. The famous Orion correlation theory, proposed by Robert Bauval, suggests the three main Giza pyramids mirror the belt stars of Orion as they appeared in 10,500 BCE. Intriguingly, the Sumerians associated their own primary gods with that same constellation. Enlil, the supreme god, was linked to the stars of what we call Orion. The layout of the cult cities of Enlil, Nippur, Enki, Eridu, and Anu, Uruk, may themselves form a terrestrial correlation to Orion's belt, created millennia before the Egyptians arranged their pyramids. If true, this points not to coincidence or independent invention, but to the sharing of a common, archaic astronomical blueprint, a sacred geography, inherited from a precursor civilization. This blueprint required knowledge of subtle astronomical cycles that take thousands of years to become apparent. The Sumerians, emerging around 4000 BCE, should not have had the observational baseline to detect, for example, the precessional shift of Orion's belt over millennia. Yet their mythology and city planning suggest they were working from a snapshot of the sky from a much earlier epoch, a template handed down to them. This perfectly aligns with their own written claims, that the knowledge came from the Apkallu sages before the flood, who were given the plans of heaven and earth by Enki. The architecture and celestial alignments are the physical, enduring proof of that transfer. They are the concrete manifestation of the me of kingship and temple building. One does not slowly evolve the precise alignment of a temple to true north. One builds it that way from the first foundation stone, according to a pre-existing instruction. The mathematical harmony, the celestial orientation, and the geodetic patterns of early Sumer speak of a first-generation civilization working from a sophisticated master plan, not a primitive society fumbling its way toward complexity. The stones and the stars, in silent agreement, testify to a forgotten genesis. The linguistic isolation of the Sumerian language presents a profound and often overlooked mystery that adds another layer of depth to the enigma of their origins. Languages, like biological species, are typically part of family trees, evolving from common ancestors and showing clear relationships through vocabulary, grammar, and syntax. Yet Sumerian stands utterly alone. It is a language isolate with no demonstrable kinship to any other known language family, not to the Semitic languages like Akkadian that surrounded it, not to Indo-European, not to any language of the Caucasus, Anatolia, or the Iranian plateau. This isolation is not merely a curiosity. It is a screaming anomaly in the heart of the world's first civilization. When the Sumerians appear in the historical record around 3500 BCE, their language is already fully developed, complex, and capable of expressing abstract legal, literary, and scientific concepts. There is no evidence of a Proto-Sumerian form. It emerges in the cuneiform script as a complete and sophisticated system. Its grammar is agglutinative, building words and entire sentences by stringing together discrete morphemes, each with a specific meaning, resulting in incredibly long, compound words that function like mathematical equations. For example, a single Sumerian verb can encode not just the action, but also the subject, object, direction of the action, toward or away from the speaker, the beneficiary, and the speaker's attitude toward the event. This creates a language of extreme precision and minimal ambiguity, but also one of immense complexity, more akin to a computer programming language or a formal logical system than a naturally evolved vernacular. This complexity appears frozen in time. Unlike other ancient languages that show clear evolution from archaic to classical forms over centuries, Sumerian, as recorded in tablets from 2500 BCE, is grammatically identical to that in tablets from 1800 BCE. It did not evolve. It was preserved. This preservation was deliberate. When the Akkadians conquered Sumer around 2334 BCE, they did not suppress the language. Instead, for the next 2,000 years, Sumerian became the classical, sacred language of scholarship, religion, and law, the Latin of Mesopotamia, studied and copied by scribes long after it ceased to be anyone's mother tongue. Thousands of school tablets from places like Nippur are bilingual dictionaries and grammatical exercises, painstakingly teaching Akkadian-speaking scribes this ancient, difficult tongue. These textbooks often note certain forms as old or as spoken in ancient times, indicating that even the Babylonians recognized they were learning a language that had ossified in a state of antique perfection. The question is, why? Why would a conqueror adopt and venerate the language of the conquered unless it was perceived not as a tribal dialect, but as the vessel of ultimate, foundational knowledge? The Sumerians themselves claimed their language was a divine gift. The goddess Nisaba, patron of writing and grain, was credited with giving the measuring rod and the stylus, intertwining the concepts of agricultural planning, mathematical measurement, and written language. A hymn to Enki states he directed the words of the great gods and made the tongue of Sumer resplendent. The verb made resplendent implies he did not invent language, but took an existing system and refined it, clarified it, set it into its perfect, final form for human use. This echoes the concept of the me. Language itself was a discrete component of the civilization package, delivered and installed. The isolation of Sumerians suggests a terrifying possibility. It may be the last surviving remnant of the linguistic substrate of the pre-flood world. If a cataclysm obliterated the civilization of the Anunnaki and their human hybrid servants, leaving only scattered survivors, the language of that lost world could have survived in fragmented, purified form among the inheritors who rebuilt in Sumer. The strange substrate vocabulary within Sumerian, words for plants, tools, and places that have no Sumerian etymology, could be fossil words from that lost precursor tongue. Linguist Samuel Noah Kramer identified many such terms, labeling them pre-Sumerian. But if they are pre-Sumerian, what does that make Sumerian itself? Perhaps not the first language, but the reformed language, the resplendent administrative and sacred tongue imposed upon the survivors to organize the new age. This linguistic mystery deepens when one considers the near impossibility of the cuneiform script emerging ex nihilo. The earliest Uruk IV tablets, circa 3400 BCE, show a script already capable of complex administrative record-keeping. The leap from simple accounting tokens to a full phonetic and logographic writing system is a cognitive revolution that, according to standard models, should take centuries. In Sumer, it appears to happen within a few generations. Some researchers, like the French archaeologist Jean-Jacques Glasner, argue that proto-cuneiform was initially a numerical and ideographic notation system not tied to any specific spoken language, a kind of universal symbolic code. Only later was the Sumerian language mapped onto this pre-existing code. If true, this means the writing system may predate the language that came to use it. This turns the standard model of linguistic evolution on its head. First came a sophisticated written code, then came the language that gave it voice. This sequence perfectly fits the Sumerian own account. The me, the divine decrees, including writing, descended first. Then Enki made resplendent the tongue to articulate them. The language, therefore, was not born of the grunts of laborers or the songs of shamans. It was engineered for a purpose, to be the precise, unambiguous vehicle for administering a divinely ordained civilization. Its isolation is not an accident of history. It is a design feature. It had no relatives because it was not meant to evolve. It was meant to be the stable, eternal software for running the human experiment. When we look at Sumerian grammar with its verb chains encoding direction and intent, we are not looking at the organic growth of human communication. We are looking at a control language built for issuing clear, unambiguous instructions and recording events with meticulous, legalistic precision. The conquerors who adopted it, the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, were not adopting a culture. They were adopting an operating manual. They studied it not to converse with the conquered, but to access the source code of the system they now governed. The silence of its origins, its stubborn isolation, and its frozen complexity are not gaps in the historical record. They are, in themselves, the record. They tell us that the voice of Sumer was not a voice that grew from the soil. It was a voice that was given, a precise and perfect tool, and its eerie silence on the familial tree of human speech screams louder than any translation ever could about the unnaturalness of its birth. The global distribution of core mythological motifs, architectural principles, and astronomical knowledge that mirror Sumerian concepts suggests the influence of this source civilization blueprint was not confined to Mesopotamia, but was a worldwide phenomenon, carried by the diaspora of survivors from a common cataclysmic event. The Sumerian narrative is not an isolated curiosity. It is the clearest and earliest written expression of an archetype found on every inhabited continent. Consider the flood myth, the Sumerian biblical structure of divine warning, a built vessel, the destruction of the old world, the landing on a mountain, and the receipt of a new covenant is replicated in the Greek story of Deucalion, the Vedic tale of Manu, the Chinese legend of Great Yu, and the countless indigenous stories from the Americas and Oceania. While diffusionist theories suggest cultural spread from a single point, the consistency in detail, such as the sending out of birds to find land, argues for a shared, experiential memory of a real event, not slow, distorted transmission of a story. But the parallels go far deeper than a flood. The concept of gods or culture bearers descending from the sky to impart knowledge is universal. In Egypt, the god Thoth, the lord of divine words, descends to give humanity writing, mathematics, astronomy, and law. He is depicted as an ibis-headed or baboon-headed being, a hybrid form echoing the Apkallu's fish-human hybridity. The Egyptian Book of the Dead contains spells and knowledge said to be of immense antiquity, from the time of the gods. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan to the Maya, arrives from across the eastern sea, a tall, bearded, light-skinned figure who teaches agriculture, maize cultivation, astronomy, the calendar, writing, and arts before departing, promising to return. The Maya Popol Vuh speaks of earlier creations destroyed by flood and then by fire, and of gods who fashioned the first humans from maize dough after failed attempts with mud and wood, a clear parallel to the Sumerian trial-and-error creation in Atrahasis. In the Andean region, Viracocha, the creator god, emerges from Lake Titicaca, creates a race of giants, destroys them in a flood, and then creates modern humans, teaching them language, arts, and agriculture before walking away across the Pacific. In ancient China, the legendary Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, is described arriving in a chariot pulled by dragons, bringing with him a host of inventions: writing, the compass, medicine, pottery, silk, and the calendar. He is said to have fought a great war with other godlike beings, using advanced technologies, before establishing order. In the Hebrew tradition, the non-canonical Book of Enoch provides a startlingly Sumerian parallel. It describes the Watchers, angels who descend to earth, take human wives, and teach humanity forbidden knowledge. Metallurgy, cosmetics, weapon-making, astrology, and sorcery. Their hybrid offspring, the Nephilim, are giants who corrupt the earth, leading to God's decision to send the flood. This is almost a direct retelling of the Apkallu saga and the antediluvian corruption that prompted Enlil to send the deluge in Atrahasis. Even in seemingly isolated cultures like that of the Dogon in Mali, West Africa, their complex astronomical knowledge includes an understanding of Sirius's binary star system, Sirius B, a dense white dwarf invisible to the naked eye and only confirmed by Western astronomy in the 19th century. The Dogon claim this knowledge was given to them by amphibious beings, the Namo, who descended from the sky in a vessel accompanied by fire and thunder. The parallels are too specific, too structural, to be dismissed as independent invention. They point to a common source, a primordial event or series of events witnessed by humanity's ancestors, which then diversified into local mythologies. The architectural correlation is equally compelling. The global prevalence of the pyramid form, from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia and the step pyramids of Saqqara to the colossal structures at Giza, the Mesoamerican pyramids at Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza, and even the massive ancient pyramid structures recently identified in Indonesia and Bosnia, suggests a shared architectural principle or symbolic purpose. While styles differ, the core concept of a man-made mountain, a stairway to heaven, connecting Earth to the realm of the gods, is universal. Many of these pyramids are precisely aligned to cardinal points or specific stars, encoding astronomical knowledge. The Great Pyramid's shafts point to Orion and Sirius, stars associated with Osiris and Isis, whose myths of death and resurrection mirror Inanna's descent. Teotihuacan's Avenue of the Dead is aligned to the Pleiades. This global practice of as above, so below, building terrestrial mirrors of celestial order, implies a shared, archaic doctrine of sacred geography, a blueprint for aligning human civilization with cosmic principles. The most parsimonious explanation for this global pattern is not that Sumerians traveled the world, but that the world's early cultures are the fragmented descendants of a common progenitor civilization that was shattered by the cataclysms at the end of the last ice age. This progenitor culture, whether Atlantis, Lemuria, or the civilization of the Gulf Oasis, possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy, geodesy, agriculture, and social organization. When their world was destroyed by rising seas and climatic chaos around 9600 BCE, survivors scattered, carrying with them the core myths, the basic technological package, agriculture, megalithic construction, and the sacred astronomical blueprint. They settled in river valleys, the Nile, Indus, Yellow River, Mesopotamia, and highland basins, the Andes, Mexican plateau, and began the slow process of rebuilding. The Sumerians, emerging in the historically fortunate location of Mesopotamia with its preservative clay tablets, were merely the first to commit this inherited tradition to permanent writing. Their king list, their creation myths, and their descriptions of the Anunnaki are not the beginning of the story. They are the most complete midpoint of the story, the clearest echo of a much older, lost chapter in human history. The global myths are not copies of Sumerian texts. They are cousin narratives, born from the same traumatic, formative event. They collectively testify that the dawn of history as we know it was not a dawn at all, but a twilight, a struggling remembrance after a long, catastrophic night. The integration of the Sumerian anomalous evidence with modern scientific paradigms, particularly in genetics, climatology, and systems theory, does not comfortably resolve the contradictions but rather heightens them, suggesting our current models are incomplete and that the Sumerian account may represent a valid, if distorted, historical perspective. Beginning with genetics, the Human Genome Project and subsequent paleogenomic studies have revealed a history far more complex and punctuated than the smooth narrative of human evolution suggests. A significant discovery is the genetic bottleneck event, occurring roughly 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, where the global human population collapsed to between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. This near-extinction event is often attributed to the Toba supereruption, but its precise cause remains debated. What followed this bottleneck, however, is termed the Great Leap Forward or the dawn of behavioral modernity. A rapid, almost explosive development of abstract thought, symbolic art, complex language, and advanced toolmaking. From a genetic standpoint, this transition is jarringly swift. Furthermore, scientists have identified regions of the human genome known as human accelerated regions, HARs. These are stretches of DNA that have undergone a dramatically accelerated rate of mutation in the human lineage compared to chimpanzees. HAR1, for instance, is involved in cerebral cortex development and has changed more in the 6 million years since the human-chimp split than in the previous 300 million years of vertebrate evolution. The geneticist Dr. David Reich, in his work on ancient DNA, has also revealed multiple, now-extinct hominid lineages that interbred with early Homo sapiens, including Neanderthals and Denisovans, whose genetic legacy persists in modern populations. This paints a picture of a messy, hybrid prehistory, not a linear progression. The Sumerian Atrahasis epic, describing the creation of the Lulu by mixing divine essence, blood, with earthly clay, can be read as a Bronze Age allegory for such a hybridization or genetic engineering event, a sudden, deliberate modification that produced a new, cognitively advanced worker. The extended lifespans of the antediluvian kings could be a folk memory of a time when these hybrid or earlier human lineages possessed different biological parameters, or when the environmental and atmospheric conditions of the pre-flood world were radically different, perhaps with higher oxygen levels or a reduced pathogen load. The Sumerian claim of a designed humanity, therefore, while not literally true in the mythic sense, aligns eerily with the genetic evidence of a rapid, punctuated, and complex origin for modern human cognition. In climatology, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, though controversial, proposes that around 12,800 years ago, a fragmented comet or asteroid struck the Earth's ice sheets, triggering a 1,200-year return to glacial conditions, massive wildfires, and catastrophic flooding. This event, proponents argue, wiped out the North American megafauna and the advanced Clovis culture and triggered the sudden meltwater pulses that raised sea levels by hundreds of feet. Geological evidence for this includes a global layer containing nanodiamonds, platinum spikes, and melted glass, materials formed under extreme temperatures. If valid, this hypothesis provides a precise, global cataclysm that fits the timeline of the Great Flood in numerous traditions and could have erased a nascent global civilization. The Sumerian flood layer, dated to around 2900 BCE, would then represent a later, localized echo of this much earlier, foundational catastrophe, preserved in cultural memory and later conflated with a major Mesopotamian inundation. From a systems theory perspective, the Sumerian account of a delivered civilization makes a disturbing kind of sense. Complex systems, whether biological ecosystems, computer networks, or societies, do not arise from simplicity by chance. They require an infusion of information or energy to achieve a higher state of organization. The modern model assumes this infusion came from within human ingenuity. The Sumerian model claims it came from without the Anunnaki. The sudden, simultaneous appearance of writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and urban planning in Sumer exhibits the characteristics of a system receiving a pre-configured information package. There is no missing link city showing half-writing or trial law codes. The system is fully operational from its first appearance. This is analogous to panspermia in biology, the theory that life's building blocks arrived on Earth via comets. The Sumerian thesis is a form of cultural panspermia. The seeds of complex society arrived from an external source. Even the concept of the discrete, transferable modules of cultural knowledge parallels modern software engineering, where complex programs are built from modular libraries of code. The myth of Inanna stealing the is like a story of one faction obtaining the source code from another. This perspective reframes the Anunnaki not necessarily as literal space aliens, but perhaps as a metaphor for a highly advanced, now vanished human civilization that survived the Younger Dryas cataclysm and sought to reboot the species. Their descent from heaven could symbolize their arrival from a mountainous refuge or a surviving island, like Plato's Atlantis, to the traumatized survivors on the plains. Their divine longevity and power would be the natural perception by primitive survivors of a technologically superior remnant people. The elongated skulls, the advanced knowledge, the complex language, all could be artifacts of this lost progenitor culture. The suppression of this narrative, then, is not a conspiracy but a paradigm protection instinct. Modern academia is built on the pillars of Darwinian gradualism and humanistic self-determination. The Sumerian evidence, especially when amplified by genetics and catastrophic geology, suggests a model of punctuated equilibrium for civilization itself. Long periods of stagnation, interrupted by catastrophic resets and rapid restructuring from a preserved kernel of advanced knowledge. This model is deeply threatening because it removes humanity from the center of its own story, suggesting we are not the authors of our destiny but the heirs, and perhaps the wards of a forgotten legacy. To accept this is to accept that history is not a record of our triumph, but of our inheritance, and that our current age may be just another cycle in a series, destined to be washed away and rebooted once more, with the next survivors looking back at our skyscrapers and satellites with the same awe and confusion with which the Sumerians regarded the ziggurats and star charts they could not fully explain but faithfully preserved. The fate of the physical evidence that could potentially validate or refute the more radical interpretations of Sumerian texts, the anomalous skeletons, the suppressed tablets, the out-of-place artifacts, forms a shadow history of 20th and 21st century archaeology, marked by institutional neglect, deliberate destruction, and a pervasive culture of epistemological gatekeeping. The pattern begins with the discovery itself. When Leonard Woolley documented elongated skulls at UR, they were photographed, noted in field reports, and then shipped to the storage basements of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum. They were never the subject of a major published osteological study. Their existence became a footnote, a curious anomaly relegated to specialist appendices, never integrated into the public narrative of Sumerian origins. This was not necessarily malicious. It was a function of priority. The gold of UR made headlines and drew crowds. Strange bones did not. But the consequence was the effective burial of the evidence a second time. At Kish, the detailed sketches of anomalous crania in Ernest Mackay's notes gathered dust in Oxford. In Iraq, many skeletal collections were left undercurated in the Baghdad Museum, vulnerable to the chaos of war. The looting in 2003 was catastrophic, but it also revealed a prior sin of omission. Countless artifacts and tablets had never been properly catalogued or studied. They were in a state of academic limbo, and their loss meant any secrets they held were permanently erased. The same fate befell countless Ubaid figurines and other perplexing artifacts, often labeled vaguely as ritual objects, and filed away without rigorous analysis of their consistent, non-human morphology. The case of the cuneiform tablets is even more telling. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh contained over 30,000 fragments. A century and a half later, only about one-third have been fully translated and published. The rest sit in trays in museum basements, accessible only to a handful of specialists who must navigate Byzantine access protocols. Among these untranslated fragments, by the admission of Assyriologists themselves, are tablets dealing with astronomy, medicine, and secret knowledge of the gods. Why the delay? The reasons are mundane but effective. A shortage of experts, lack of funding, the sheer difficulty of the task, and the low academic priority given to texts that don't directly address political or economic history. This institutional inertia functions as a form of suppression. A tablet not translated is as silent as one that was never found. Furthermore, the translation history itself shows bias. Victorian scholars like George Smith and Henry Rawlinson worked within a Judeo-Christian framework that sought to reconcile Mesopotamian texts with the Bible. Later, in the 20th century, the Marxist-inspired, materialist school of archaeology dominated, focusing exclusively on economic, climatic, and social structural explanations. In both frameworks, texts speaking of gods intervening directly in history were filtered. They were either primitive mythology, the religious view, or ideological superstructure masking class interests, the materialist view. The literal content was dismissed a priori. A tablet describing Enki giving the me of metalworking was translated as the god Enki bestowed the art of metalworking, and filed under religion, not as a potential historical claim about knowledge transfer. The physical destruction of evidence in the 21st century has been more overt and tragic. The ISIS rampage through Mosul and Nimrud in 2015 was ideologically driven iconoclasm, but it targeted the very repositories of this ancient knowledge. Videos show militants using sledgehammers on Assyrian reliefs depicting Apkallu sages and winged discs, and bulldozing temple libraries. This was not just the destruction of art. It was the eradication of memory. These sites held tablets that had never been excavated, let alone translated. Their loss is absolute. Even without malice, the standard archaeological method contributes to the problem. Stratigraphy and carbon dating are powerful, but they rely on assumptions of gradual deposition and rely on recoverable organic material. A catastrophic flood that scours a city to bedrock, then deposits 8 feet of sterile silt, creates a stratigraphic gap that destroys the very evidence needed to understand what came before. The deep time of the antediluvian period, if it existed, would lie beneath that sterile layer, and may have been obliterated by the flood itself or by the foundations of the later cities built atop it. We are left with an absence which conventional science interprets as nothing was there, but which the tradition interprets as what was there was erased. The final, most subtle form of suppression is peer pressure and academic careerism. A young archaeologist or Assyriologist focusing on the literal historical claims of the Anunnaki, or proposing a lost progenitor civilization, would find their work rejected by mainstream journals, denied funding, and ridiculed at conferences. Their career would stall. The safe path is to work within the established paradigm. Study Sumerian economics, kingship rituals, or literary themes. This creates a systemic filter where only conforming ideas are amplified, and challenging evidence is sidelined as the work of pseudo-archaeologists. Thus, the elongated skulls are not studied because they are probably just cranial deformation, and no one funds a costly DNA test to prove otherwise. The precise astronomical data is explained as late Babylonian cleverness, ignoring the text's own claims of antiquity. The net result is a fragmented, sanitized version of Mesopotamia presented to the public, a world of pragmatic kings, hard-working farmers, and colorful but meaningless gods. The profound, unsettling core of their belief system, that they were a colony, a project, a rebooted species, is carefully excised. It is relegated to the realm of popular ancient astronaut books, which in turn allows mainstream academics to dismiss the entire subject as fringe nonsense, creating a perfect, self-reinforcing cycle of ignorance. The evidence is not so much hidden as it is ignored, mislabeled, understudied, and fragmented. It exists in museum storage rooms, in untranslated tablets, in the footnotes of old excavation reports, and in the destroyed rubble of Mosul. To piece it together requires crossing disciplinary boundaries, questioning foundational assumptions, and facing professional ostracism. The Sumerian secret is thus protected not by a single guardian, but by the very architecture of modern knowledge itself. The psychological and philosophical implications of accepting the Sumerian account as a distorted historical record, rather than mere mythology, are profound and unsettling, forcing a re-evaluation of humanity's place in the cosmos, the nature of consciousness, and the ultimate purpose of our civilization. At its core, the Sumerian worldview presents a teleological challenge to the dominant modern narratives of existentialism and humanism. Existentialism posits that humans are born into a universe without inherent meaning or divine plan, and must create their own purpose through acts of will and authenticity. Humanism elevates human reason, agency, and ethical autonomy as the highest values. The Sumerian narrative directly undermines both. If humanity was engineered by the Anunnaki as a labor force, then our origin is not one of noble savagery or spiritual emergence, but of utilitarian design. Our purpose, at least initially, was not to seek meaning but to fulfill a function. This introduces a potentially traumatic archetype into the human psyche, the worker complex, a deep-seated, species-level memory of being created for servitude, which could manifest in our simultaneous drives for productivity and rebellion, our attraction to and resentment of authority, and our existential angst when devoid of assigned tasks. The myth of the Ijiji rebellion, which prompted our creation, might be our foundational story. We were made to replace rebellious laborers, embedding within us both a propensity for toil and a latent impulse to rebel against our own creators or their inherited systems. Furthermore, if the complete package of civilization, was downloaded rather than discovered, then human progress is not the result of innate genius and perseverance, but of following an instruction manual. Our greatest achievements in law, art, science, and governance would then be acts of remembrance, not innovation. This reframes human history as a process of gradual, often faulty decipherment of a user guide for a technology we do not fully understand. It suggests that our periodic dark ages are not setbacks, but periods of data corruption or lost access to the source code, and our renaissances are successful recoveries of lost files. This perspective is deeply humbling, if not humiliating, to the modern ego that celebrates human ingenuity as the engine of history. It would mean a Copernican shift in self-perception. We are not the authors of our story, but characters in a script written by others, struggling to understand our lines. The theological implications are even more disruptive. The Sumerian pantheon is not a family of distant, moral archetypes, but a corporate board of directors with specialized portfolios: Enki, engineering and water; Enlil, administration and order; Inanna, love and war. They are described as having meetings, making tactical decisions, experiencing fatigue, and needing sustenance. This portrays the divine as a managerial class, not an omnipotent, omniscient singularity. If such beings were the gods of our earliest records, what does that say about the subsequent evolution of monotheism? Could the Abrahamic God be a later, simplified synthesis of this Anunnaki executive committee, with the stories of direct interaction, God walking in the garden, speaking to Moses, being echoes of the earlier, hands-on period of administration? The prohibition against graven images in later religions could be a reaction against the very real, physical representations of these beings that the Sumerians and others created. The philosophical problem of theodicy, why a good God allows suffering, takes on a different hue if the gods are not infinitely benevolent creators, but fallible engineers and administrators whose project, humanity, experienced unforeseen bugs and side effects, including self-awareness, free will, and the capacity to reject their programming. The Great Flood, sent by Enlil to wipe out a noisy, bothersome humanity, is not an act of moral judgment but a project manager deciding to scrap a failed prototype. Our survival, thanks to Enki's insider warning to Utnapishtim/Atrahasis, is not a covenant of grace but a corporate whistleblower saving a backup copy of the data. This is a chilling, mechanistic cosmology that offers no promise of salvation, only the potential for continued maintenance and occasional upgrades. On a collective level, this narrative provides a potent explanation for the persistent human sense of alienation, the feeling of being not at home in the world. In psychoanalytic terms, it is the ultimate primal scene, the traumatic memory of our own creation as synthetic beings, a memory buried deep in the collective unconscious, expressing itself in myths of fallen angels, forgotten golden ages, and a longing to return to the stars. Our drive for space exploration, transhumanism, and artificial intelligence could then be seen not as mere curiosity, but as an innate, programmed desire to emulate our creators, to become like the Anunnaki ourselves and perhaps to find them. It also casts our environmental destruction in a new light. If the Earth was not given to us as a sacred trust, but was rather a worksite assigned to us, it might explain a subconscious, species-wide disregard for its long-term health, treating it as a resource to be exploited, as per our original design specifications. To integrate the Sumerian account seriously is to embark on a philosophical journey that leads to what might be called the Anunnaki hypothesis. The idea that human history is a monitored experiment, our civilization a controlled growth medium, and our consciousness a hybrid condition, part animal instinct, part implanted divine spark. This is not a comforting thought. It threatens all our cherished notions of autonomy, specialness, and cosmic significance. It is far easier to dismiss the cuneiform tablets as primitive fancy than to entertain the possibility that the first people to write things down were writing a literal, if allegorical, history of a truth so devastating that we have spent the subsequent 5 millennia building religions, philosophies, and ideologies to forget it. The silence of the gods in the modern age would not be evidence of their non-existence, but of their withdrawal to an observational mode, their direct management phase concluded, leaving us to run the software on our own with mixed results. Our entire spiritual and intellectual history may be one long, convoluted therapy session to deal with the trauma of that withdrawal. A potential resolution to the Sumerian paradox, one that navigates between the Scylla of literal ancient astronaut theory and the Charybdis of dismissive materialism, lies in the emerging interdisciplinary field of deep history and the study of cultural catastrophism. This framework does not require accepting that flesh and blood aliens built ziggurats, but it does demand taking the Sumerians' own historical consciousness with utmost seriousness. The key is to interpret their accounts not as journalism, but as anamnesis, the recollection of a traumatic past through the symbolic and numerical language available to them. The central, non-negotiable claim is that the Sumerians believed they were inheritors, not inventors. This belief must have an origin. The deep history approach, pioneered by scholars like Daniel Lord Smale, seeks to bridge the gap between prehistory and history by using insights from genetics, archaeology, climatology, and mythology to construct a longer, more integrated human story. From this vantage point, the antediluvian kings with their 241,200-year reigns can be seen as a chronological compression of a vastly long oral prehistory. In cultures without precise calendrics, time is often measured in generations or legendary epochs. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, with its base of 60, is ideal for representing large, symbolic numbers. The reigns may represent not individuals, but entire lineages, tribes, or cultural phases of a lost pre-Neolithic society that existed before the climactic upheavals of the Younger Dryas period, c. 10,800 to 9,600 BCE. This society, potentially centered on the now submerged continental shelves and river valleys like the Persian Gulf oasis, could have achieved a level of social complexity and environmental management far beyond what we attribute to hunter-gatherers. They would have possessed detailed astronomical knowledge gained over millennia of stable observation, a sophisticated understanding of plant and animal domestication, and perhaps even early forms of proto-writing and monumental construction. This is the hypothetical source civilization, or Göbekli Tepe precursor culture. When the ice sheets melted catastrophically around 9,600 BCE, this culture was fragmented and drowned. Survivors, carrying the core of this knowledge, the Mi, fled to higher ground, the Armenian highlands, the Anatolian plateau, and the flanks of the Zagros Mountains. For millennia, they lived as displaced, highland custodians of a broken legacy, their story devolving into myth. Then, around 400 to 3500 BCE, as climatic conditions stabilized, these heirs descended into the newly fertile and empty alluvial plain of Mesopotamia. They were not primitive nomads discovering agriculture. They were the descendants of a shattered maritime/riparian civilization deliberately reestablishing a structured, irrigated, urban society based on their preserved blueprint. They remembered how to build a city, how to align a temple, how to chart Venus, because they had done it before in a different land now under the sea. The Anunnaki in this model are the deified memory of the elite ruling class or the wise ancestors of that lost civilization. Their descent from heaven is the migration from the highlands, the mountain of the gods, down to the plain. Their incredible longevity is the elongated time depth of ancestral memory. The Apkallu sages are the specific, named knowledge-bearers who led this cultural transplantation. The flood is the literal geological memory of the cataclysm that destroyed their original home, later conflated with major local Tigris-Euphrates floods. This model elegantly reconciles the data. It explains the sudden appearance of full-blown civilization. It was a planned recolonization, not a spontaneous generation. It explains the advanced astronomy. It was preserved knowledge, not contemporary discovery. It explains the isolation of the Sumerian language. It could be the preserved liturgical or administrative tongue of that lost culture, kept pure by a priestly caste. It explains the global flood and culture-bearer myths. They all stem from the same planetary catastrophe and diaspora. It even explains the Ubaid figurines with elongated heads. They could be stylized representations of these revered, ancient ancestors or their ruling caste, who may have practiced cranial deformation as a mark of status, a tradition remembered but no longer understood by their descendants. This refugee civilization hypothesis is far more archaeologically plausible than extraterrestrial intervention, yet it fully validates the emotional and historical truth of the Sumerian documents. They were recording real history, the history of their people's catastrophic origin and their mission to rebuild a lost world. The numbers were symbolic code for an immensely long time ago, and the gods were the personified forces of nature and ancestral genius that guided them. This framework also explains the pattern of evidence suppression. It is threatening not because it introduces aliens, but because it shatters the linear, progressive cradle of civilization model. It suggests that the cradle was a rebirth. It implies that complex society is far older than we think, that it can be utterly erased by climate change, and that our own civilization, built on the same alluvial plains now threatened by rising seas, might be just the latest iteration in a cyclical process. This makes Sumerian studies not an arcane specialty, but the most urgent kind of history, a case study in civilizational collapse and recovery. The Anunnaki, therefore, become a powerful metaphor for the lost potential of our own species. They are the part of us that mastered the environment, mapped the stars, and built a lasting order, only to be brought low by planetary forces beyond its control. Their return is not a spaceship in the sky, but the imperative to recover that lost knowledge of sustainability and resilience before the next cycle of catastrophe concludes. The clay tablets, then, are not a message from outer space, but a message from deep time. A warning from the last reboot, inscribed in the hope that the next inheritors might understand what they truly are. Survivors charged with maintaining a fragile world, holding a borrowed blueprint they must learn to read before the waters rise again. The modern technological and scientific trajectory of humanity, when viewed through the lens of the Sumerian paradigm, takes on the eerie character of a predetermined program executing itself, a systematic unlocking of the me or divine decrees according to a hidden timetable. This perspective suggests that our so-called progress is not a series of random breakthroughs but a gradual decipherment of an embedded legacy code, leading us inexorably toward a state that mirrors the attributes of the Anunnaki as described in the ancient texts. Consider the sequential unfolding of key technologies. The Sumerians recorded the gift of the me for metalworking, writing, and law. In our modern era, we see an accelerated mastery of materials science, nanotechnology, metamaterials, information science, digital encoding, global data networks, and complex global governance systems and international law. This is not merely advancement. It is the scaling up and refining of the original civilization package. The Anunnaki were depicted as using advanced tools, wearing elaborate garments, and traveling in celestial vehicles. Humanity has now entered the age of wearable technology, advanced aerospace engineering, and is seriously contemplating interplanetary travel. The winged disk of Mesopotamian iconography finds its crude echoes in our rockets, satellites, and conceptual spacecraft. The Anunnaki were described as having the ability to manipulate life, creating the Lulu from clay and divine blood. Today, humanity stands on the precipice of genetic engineering, synthetic biology, and artificial intelligence. the power to create and alter life forms, and perhaps soon conscious beings of our own design. This parallel is too stark to ignore. It is as if we are following a developmental checklist. Master the element of earth, agriculture, mining, master the element of water, shipping, hydrology, master the element of air, flight, telecommunications, and now, master the element of life itself, genetics, AI. The ultimate goal of this trajectory, implied by the Sumerian narrative, is to become like our creators, to achieve the longevity, knowledge, and technological sovereignty of the Anunnaki. This is the unspoken telos of transhumanism. The quest for life extension, cognitive enhancement, and cybernetic integration is not a new human dream. It is the reactivation of a primordial memory of what we were designed to eventually become, or perhaps what we once were before a great diminishment. The flood, in this context, can be seen as a system crash that reduced humanity to a lower operational state, from which we have been slowly rebooting and recompiling our original operating system over the last 5,000 years. Our current digital age, with its emphasis on networks, information storage, and virtual reality, mirrors the Sumerian concept of the me as discrete, storable, and transferable data packets. The Internet is a global, albeit chaotic, repository of me, accessible to all. The scientific method itself, with its principles of observation, replication, and peer review, can be seen as a systematic, democratized process for rediscovering the lost me of the natural world, a process that began not with the Enlightenment, but with the first Sumerian scribe recording an astronomical observation. This interpretation casts our current global crises in a specific light. The environmental degradation, resource wars, and societal upheaval are not just growing pains of a young technological species. They are the predictable stresses of a system rapidly outgrowing its original, planetary worksite specifications. The Anunnaki, according to the Atrahasis epic, found humanity's noise and overpopulation bothersome, leading to the flood. Today, anthropogenic noise, sonic, electronic, light, fills the biosphere, and overpopulation strains global systems. Are we unconsciously recreating the precise conditions that prompted the last reset? The Sumerian warning is not about wrathful gods, but about system failure due to unsustainable growth within a closed environment. The promise, however, is also embedded in the mythos. Enki, the god of wisdom and a benefactor to humanity, repeatedly intervenes to preserve knowledge and seed survival. This archetype manifests today in the scientists, archivists, and visionaries who work to preserve knowledge, mitigate ecological disaster, and plan for off-world colonization, the modern Apkallu, working against the tide of short-sighted destruction. The final, most profound implication of this technological parallel is the return of the Anunnaki scenario. In myth, the gods withdrew but promised at times to return or to judge their creation. In our modern trajectory, the return may not be literal. It may be apotheosis. As we approach the technological singularity, the hypothetical moment when AI surpasses human intelligence and triggers runaway technological growth, we are, in effect, creating our own successors, digital or hybrid beings of vast intellect and potential longevity. These new gods would be of our making, yet they would be as far beyond us as we were beyond the hominids that preceded us. From the perspective of a future archaeologist looking back, the origin story of these new beings would be our own 21st century labs, a new mixing of clay, silicon, with a spark of intelligence, code. The cycle would complete. The created becomes the creator. The Sumerian king list would then be read as the first chapter of a much longer story, not of alien visitation, but of a recursive pattern in intelligent life. A legacy of creation, catastrophe, and recreation, with each cycle building or rebuilding upon the ruins of the last, striving to reach an elusive state of stability and mastery that always seems to slip away in a deluge of its own unintended consequences. We are not awaiting the gods from the sky. We are laboring, knowingly or not, to become them, and in doing so we may be setting the stage for the next Lulu, the next worker species, who will one day dig through the silt of our cities and wonder, with a mixture of awe and dread, about the beings who ruled before their flood. In the final analysis, the Sumerian cuneiform tablets are more than historical artifacts. They are a metaphysical challenge cast in clay, a permanent question mark inscribed at the very dawn of recorded history. They force upon us a choice between two fundamentally different visions of reality. The first vision, the orthodox modern view, is that humanity is a singular, triumphant accident of evolution. Through grit and innate genius, we pulled ourselves from the savannah, invented gods to explain the thunder, and slowly, painstakingly built civilization through a series of brilliant, hard-won discoveries. In this view, the Sumerian king list is a charming fiction, their gods' psychological projections, and their advanced knowledge a testament to the surprising ingenuity of early humans. This vision is comforting, empowering, and places us firmly at the center of our own heroic narrative. The second vision, the one whispered by the tablets themselves, is that we are a species with amnesia. Our dawn was not a sunrise, but a recovery from a long night. Our genius is not purely our own, but the latent flowering of an inherited potential. Our history is not a linear ascent, but a cyclical drama of catastrophe and remembrance. This vision is humbling, unsettling, and removes us from the protagonist's role, casting us instead as the heirs to a legacy we barely comprehend. The evidence does not allow for a definitive choice, but it leans disturbingly toward the second vision. The geological flood layers, the mathematical precision of the antediluvian numbers, the sudden complexity of cuneiform and astronomy, the global echo of the myths, the linguistic isolation of Sumerian, and the uncanny parallels between Anunnaki attributes and our own technological trajectory, these are not isolated quirks. Together, they form a pattern, a coherent, alternative historiography that has been filtered out because it does not fit the container of modern thought. To engage with Sumer seriously is to perform an archaeology of consciousness itself, to dig through the layers of dogma, both religious and scientific, that have been piled upon this first memory of our past. The true forbidden knowledge is not an alien secret, but the simple, revolutionary idea that human history is vastly older and more tragic than we have been taught, and that our present civilization is not the first, but may be one of many in a chain stretching back into a fogged prehistory. This knowledge is forbidden not by conspiracy, but by its sheer existential weight. It asks us to reconsider everything. Our theology? Are God's remembered administrators? Our anthropology? Are we engineered hybrids? Our history? Is progress an illusion of recovery? And our future? Are we repeating a cycle? The clay tablets, in their silent durability, offer no proofs, only data. They record that a brilliant, literate, and mathematically gifted people believed utterly in their own secondary derived status. They believed kingship descended. They believed the arts were given. They believed they were made from God and clay. We can dismiss them as primitive. Or we can consider the terrifying possibility that they were remembering something real. The wind that stirs the reeds in the drained marshes of southern Iraq is the same wind that blew when Enki walked in Eridu. The stars they charted with such accuracy still turn above the rubble of their ziggurats. The human drive to build, to calculate, to reach heavenward, remains undimmed. The only thing that has changed is our story of why we do these things. The Sumerians had a story that connected them directly to the cosmos, a story of descent and inheritance. We have a story of lonely ascent and self-creation. Perhaps the truth is a synthesis. We are the children of both earth and sky, of both accident and design, struggling to remember a parentage that is half lost in the floodwaters of time. The tablets are the message in the bottle from that shipwreck. To ignore them is to ignore the first and most persistent voice of our own collective memory. To understand them may be the key to understanding not just where we came from, but what we are meant to become, and whether, this time, we can break the cycle before the waters rise to claim another forgotten chapter in the long, strange story of humankind. The excavation is no longer just in the sands of Iraq. It is in the assumptions of our textbooks, the dogmas of our sciences, and the deepest layers of our own forgotten minds. The Sumerians have spoken. The question is no longer what they meant, but whether we have the courage to listen.